Good morning, 9 a.m. here in California. I don't know, I'm sure it's all kinds of different times of day depending where you are. So welcome and thanks for joining this discussion. We're talking about feedback in second language writing, and we have about an hour. I was told this is really meant to be a discussion, not a presentation or a lecture. So I have some discussion questions I thought I would throw out there, and just kind of see where it takes us. And then toward the end, maybe we can wrap it up with additional questions that we didn't get to. Or I also have a list of a few research-based insights on feedback to second language writing that I can share if we don't get to them in discussion. So that's, how does that sound, everybody?
That's good.
This is Sylvia Pessoa. Can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure, go ahead, Sylvia.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining our webinar. I'm Sylvia Pessoa. I'm the chair of the Second Language Writing IS. I am happy to see that so many of you were able to join us today. I hope everyone is okay with the recording of this session. So Tisol is going to record it so that other Second Language Writing IS members who were not able to join now can listen to the webinar and learn from our discussion. So I hope everyone is okay with the recording of this session. Thank you, and as you can imagine, the purpose of these webinars is to invite experts in our field to share insights about important aspects of second language writing. So that's why we have Dana Ferris today to share with us some insights on feedback in second language writing. So thank you very much, Dana, for participating in the webinar today. And as you all know, she's an expert on writing feedback, so there's a lot that we can learn from her practice and her research. Thank you very much, Dana.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. And again, welcome everybody. This is Dana Ferris here in California. So as I said a couple minutes ago, I'm just going to throw out some discussion questions and see where they take us. So my first question, just to open it up, is I'd like you to think about yourself as a writer, either as a student writer or a professional writer or both, and types and feedback that you have received about your own writing. What types of feedback styles or approaches have you found helpful or unhelpful or frustrating? So the question is, thinking about your own writing as a student or as a professional, what sorts of feedback have you received, and what approaches have been helpful, unhelpful, or frustrating?
So this is Sylvia Pessoa. Anybody can participate and share any experience. Please give your name and your affiliation so we can learn more about you and your work. Hello, are you?
Yeah, can you jump in at any time? Okay, shall I start?
Sure.
Okay, my name is Ryan Miller. I'm from Kent State University in Ohio, and just thinking about feedback that I've received on my writing, I think feedback that I found most helpful is feedback that explains the thought process behind the feedback, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Feedback that kind of explains the thought process of the person giving the feedback, not just a suggestion for what to change, but kind of the why behind it.
Oh, very nice. Nice comment. Thanks, Brian. Someone else?
Well, when I was a student back in Vietnam, I didn't really get much feedback, but the feedback I received was very direct. The instructor, kind of rewrote what I have written, and I found that was really useful to me.
So the teacher actually rewrote your work, and you liked that. You found that was helpful.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Does anyone remember getting feedback on your writing that was not helpful or that was frustrating? I'll share one. So I was working on a book, and I'll be a little vague here. I was working on a book a few years ago, and I had several editors working on my book, and they gave me so much feedback that it was overwhelming. It actually shut me down and made me, I actually stopped working on the book for about 3 months because every page of the entire book was just covered with comments. It was just too much for me to deal with. So, and by that time I was an experienced writer and an experienced teacher, and I thought, wow, if that was too much for me, if we cover a page with too much feedback, how does that affect students?
This is Sylvia Pessoa, and in thinking about writing for publication also, sometimes the reviews that you can get can be frustrating because one reviewer tells you one thing and the other reviewer tells you something else, or one journal tells you to go one direction and then another journal tells you to go another direction. So it's really hard to reconcile both kinds of feedback to know where to go.
Yeah, so that's a really good comment, Sylvia. So if to a writer the feedback feels like, well, it just depends, the teacher or the reader, it changes every time. There's no clear standard for what's okay. It just really depends on the person. That can be pretty hard to figure out. That can be frustrating. So when you think about yourself as a writer and you think about yourself as a teacher of second language writers, do you think the same approaches that work well for you would also work well for second language L2 young writers? Are good approaches that are good for you, are they good for all students, or do they need to be different?
Well, I think each student is different. They have different educational backgrounds and experiences and preferences. So the feedback sometimes to me would be useful may not be as useful to my students. This is important for me, I think, to know what my students are expecting from me and what their preferences are.
Considering individual student differences and maybe their preferences for feedback is a useful thing for a teacher. What do the rest of you think about that? Is it realistic to tailor feedback to the preferences of individual students, or do you need to do the same thing for everyone?
This is Sylvia Pessoa. To me, it's not so much a matter of the preferences of the students, but it's more about the difference in needs. So some students might need kind of feedback at the very general level, like, this is not an argument, and we need to spend time, brainstorming ideas of how to make an argument out of their writing, whereas some students need more feedback on more at the micro level of writing in terms of, expressing their ideas in a clear way and organized way. So to me, it depends on the needs of the students. And from my experience, I see that students come in so diverse, with such diverse needs.
Now, good time. At fully calm.
So it's not so much about students' preferences as about different students need different things. Other comments about that? About meeting students' individual feedback?
Now, this is on the advice of medical persons because I was having stomach stop. Okay? Stomach stop, 2 years, and I got sick of it.
I guess just thinking about students' preferences, I mean, I guess the types of feedback that students are used to receiving and how that might be the kind of feedback that I want to give them. I guess negotiating between maybe feedback that students want or students expect and the type of feedback that I think will be most useful for them.
Yeah, I agree. And I like this message on the screen. Students may not know what their preferences are. And there have been a few studies in the past that have surveyed students about their preferences for feedback. And one of the findings from several studies is that students wish their teachers would correct all their errors for them. Well, that's not surprising that that's what students would say. But when they were then asked, well, is it better for your teacher to correct the errors, or is it better for your teacher to indicate errors and ask me to correct them myself? Then the students would say, oh no, that's better. You know, because they didn't want to have to find their errors all by themselves, but they could see that being asked to participate in revising their own work rather than the teacher doing all the editing, they could see how that would benefit them more. But they didn't really know to express that preference until someone gave them the different choices of how it could go. So I think whether you're giving students a voice in how you're going to respond, or whether you're going to just take whatever strategy you think is best, it's good to be clear with students about what your approach and what your philosophy is. For example, in my own teaching and in my own writing, I've often said that I think teachers ought to be selective in giving feedback. I don't think they ought to try to comment on everything, every content area or every language error at the same time. I think it's overwhelming, and I just shared my own experience about this. But if that's my approach, if I'm being selective and only focusing on a few things at a time, I need to share that with students so that they know that that's what I'm doing. They know that they need to go back and look at their own work and see it again, and not think that the only things worth reconsidering are what I made comments about. So I think however we approach it, or if we have an approach that says I'm only going to talk about ideas early in the writing process and we'll focus on editing the language later, again, it's good to make that clear to the students that that's the approach, because they don't have the background we have with teacher training, and they don't know all those choices. They know their own experiences. Let me throw out another question. What if you have experience responding to L2 writers yourself as a teacher? If you have experience responding to text by second language writers, what have you struggled with as a teacher giving feedback?
I have to struggle with the amount of feedback that I am going to give. Sometimes there is just too much, feedback that I think I have to give, but then I have to see if it is too much and if it is worth it, because if it is too much, the student may not be able to fix all that I want them to fix. So that's only been my challenge.
So figuring out how much is enough and not too much. Yeah. And there are only 24 hours in a day, too, right? What else? Other things people struggle with in giving feedback to L2 writers?
I guess for me, it'd be kind of similar. Kind of being able to comment on and give feedback on everything that I think that they should receive feedback on without it being overwhelming. And I don't know. I guess finding a good balance.
else?
For me, sometimes it's sort of difficult to explain to the student what I want them to do, and if I try to, provide detailed comments, that, my comments tend to be really long. So this is what I'm struggling with sometimes.
So clarity and conciseness, concision.
Yeah, and just kind of provide enough details so they really understand what I want them to do. I think conferences help in this case to kind of clarify my intentions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to talk about conferences too, because obviously not all feedback needs to be written. I mean, depending on your teaching situation, some teachers don't have the time or space for conferences, but if you do, that is definitely, sometimes it's easier to talk through issues in a face-to-face conference than to try to write comments in ways that are informative enough without being too long and wordy.
Right, right. And I think we are lucky in our university that we do have conferences. So sometimes when I comment on students' papers, I just make a note that, hey, we're going to discuss that at the conference, so they know that we're going to talk about this. So when they come to the conference, they have some sort of agenda already.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. Is if students are coming to a conference with the teacher, it's good to have them think in advance, whether through your written feedback or through their own thinking, what they want to talk about, since there isn't unlimited time for conferences either. We, in our program, we have a forum that a lot of the teachers use. It's called the office meeting forum, where they actually are led through the process of articulating their goals and some questions that they want to talk through with the teacher during a conference. And it, gives them some responsibility and some agency for that feedback, rather than just coming into your office, throwing their paper in front of you and saying, how is it? I don't allow that with my students. No, you tell me what we're looking at. We have 15 minutes or whatever we have. You tell me what you want to talk about. Don't just shove the paper in front of me. So another question, I asked about what you struggle with in giving feedback to L2 writers. What strategies have worked well for you? And we were talking about conferences, but other strategies, whether written feedback, conferences, in-class peer review, what kinds of strategies for any of those forms of feedback do you think work well, that you're happy with?
Shows that my 2 green triangles make up 1 rhombus.
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by strategies. Could you maybe give an example?
Well, that's a good question. When you give feedback, whether it's, well, let's take written feedback. You're giving some sort of written feedback on a student paper. What are things that you have done that you think work well? That you think, I feel good about that feedback. I feel good that it helped the student. What kinds of things?
I guess I can share
This is
the
Tom.
one that No, go ahead, Tom, go ahead.
I feel like sometimes I'm always pointing out things that could be better, but I feel good about myself when even the weaker students, maybe I can find like some little bit of the writing that I can say, hey, this is great, do this again in the future.
That's good. Thanks, Tom. Yeah. So something where you can find some way to encourage them.
Oh, Sylvia was without electricity. She was texting me frantically, but I think it looks like she's back now.
Okay. So Tom was saying when you can find things to encourage the student and tell them what they did well. And in fact, this is one of the things, when I do teacher training and workshops, and even when I do peer review in my own writing classes, I always have have people look at a piece of student writing, and before they say anything critical, they have to tell me what the student did well. And, and this is often really hard for people in teacher training settings or even for students themselves, because we're so wired to look for what's wrong with things that being said, before we go there, don't say anything negative. Tell me what this student did well. Tell me what's working for you as a reader. And I think that's a good exercise for teachers to put themselves through every time they read student papers. Maybe there are some exceptions. I mean, I've had times when I feel like the student really didn't put in a good faith effort, and that I need to call them out about that a little bit. But for the most part, they do try, and these are human beings, and you don't want to just destroy them. Helping, at least finding some either overall compliment or good parts of the paper that you can compliment. I think that's good. I think it's important. What are other things you do in feedback that you think work well or have that you feel good about as a teacher?
Well, adding to your comment about strength in student writing, what I do sometimes, I don't know if that really relates to feedback, but to kind of help students feel better about their paper, I like to write some comments that are coming from me as a reader, not as a teacher. Mm-hmm. So kind of, to let them know that I'm not just evaluating their paper, but I'm also reacting to what they write.
Yeah, that's good. So reacting as a reader, not just as an evaluator.
Exactly.
Yeah, one thing I found I have to be careful about, I agree with that and I do that too, but I also have to be careful to make it clear which is which, because the student, if the student is going to revise the paper, they need to know, well, which part is just me as a person reacting, and which part is me as a teacher giving them suggestions.
Right.
Because go ahead.
Yeah. So what I do in my feedback, and I do understand that sometimes it's really hard to distinguish between those comments. So I color code my feedback. So I just assign different colors to different types of comments. For example, I have green for content, purple for organization, yellow for readers' comments, and blue for language-related comments. So I do that, and when I write my feedback in the margins, I color code them so students know that this particular comment is not, the comment asking them for the further revision, but it's just a comment from me as a reader.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. Do you find your students like that with the color coding?
Oh yeah, they do. And I also, for each draft, I attach this explanation. So this is the color.
Right.
Well, I do the colors plus the letters, so C, O, R, and L. Different types. And I explain those what those comments mean, and I attach that to each draft so they don't have to go back and see what they mean.
That's really good. That sounds like that would be an interesting research project to look at that. And I know just the journal you could publish it in. Let's talk about peer review. Have you used, if you've taught L2 writing classes or L2 writers in writing classes, have you used peer review, and how's that worked, or what have you struggled with? So peer review, let's talk about that.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm on the phone line because I couldn't get in on the computer. It said that the session was full, but I could get in on the phone for some reason. I I really avoided it for a long time because, first of all, it takes so long. I'm teaching international students in a college, and it takes so long to even teach people how to do peer anything, and group process and those kinds of things. But what I've found that works really well and keeps them on an appropriate track is using the believing doubting worksheet. I think it's Peer Elbows, where you're withholding any kind of evaluation until the very end and really concentrating on what you do and don't understand about the piece of writing. And that seems to work well.
Okay. Other thoughts about peer review, peer response?
Well, what I've asked my students to do is to have them do the peer review before they submit the essays, and my experience so far has been it's been pretty positive. The students seem to like it. They are less critical of each other's essays, as I emphasize, they should respond as a reader. As a reader, what do you think of your friend's essays? And I asked them to identify 2 good things, we call it 2 stars and a wish, 2 good things and 1 area that you would like to recommend for your friends to improve the essay. And it's been very successful to me since they are less critical of each other's essay and they get the feedback so they can improve their essays. For me, it's been working fine.
Other thoughts about peer feedback for L2 writers?
Hello, this is Sylvia. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Hi, Sylvia.
Yeah, someone just wrote a comment there, Carrie. I don't know.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, I give students structured peer review questions along with more open-ended questions so that every student is able to give feedback and so that they know what kinds of things they should be looking for. So peer review questions with open-ended questions.
Yeah, that's often how I do my peer review sessions as well in my classes. The peer review questions will vary depending on the assignment and what it is we're trying to accomplish in that assignment. But I'll give them a list of questions to consider about the paper. And then and they don't necessarily have to write answers to all of that, but what I do have them do, having considered all of those, is then they have to write 2 really good, real strengths of the paper and 2 really concrete suggestions for revision that are based on, their consideration of those other questions, more specific questions. Because every paper is going to have different strengths and weaknesses, so I don't want them to have to answer the same questions about the paper, just whatever is the most relevant. And that actually works pretty well too. I find students will take that pretty seriously, and they also really benefit from getting to see each other's papers at the same point in time, because a lot of young college students, and my program, we work mostly with freshmen, first-year students, and there's a lot of fear about writing a college paper and am I doing this right? Am I on the right track? And sometimes seeing what 1 or 2 other peers are doing reduces that anxiety. So okay, I'm on the right track, or maybe this other student's a little further along than I am, but now I see what I can do. So I think it's really beneficial. Another thing I have found is absolutely necessary to make peer feedback work in my classes is there has to be some sort of teacher accountability for it. Where maybe the teacher looks at the peer review worksheet or responses and factors it in as part of the grade or participation grade for class. The students have to know that it's not just something to do to pass the time in class. It's actually a serious thing, and the teacher's going to take it seriously. And you know, I think if it's structured well, it can work really well. And I find our students, they get mad if we don't let them do peer review sessions when they're working on a paper, because they've learned to really trust each other and rely on each other, and they really want to be able to look at each other's work.
I have one question about something you just said, Dana, about giving students a grade on their peer review. That's one thing I've always had trouble with, is how to assign grades for the peer review work.
Yeah, so I do that somewhat holistically. The way I have settled the last few years is I have part of every paper grade be related to the process elements of the assignment. So if I say you need a first draft by this date and it needs to be at least 500 words, that's part of the grade. If I ask them to do a revision memo between drafts, that's part of that grade. If we do peer review, making a really good faith effort at peer review, so I'll look at their peer review worksheets and did they follow the instructions? Did they do something thoughtful and engaged? You know, that's part of the points. So there's a certain number of points for each assignment that I direct for those elements, and if it's not a good faith or engaged attempt, or if they just didn't do it or they skipped class that day, they don't get those points. And so I'm not necessarily giving them a detailed grading scheme about their peer review, but it's more, were you there? Did you engage? Did you follow instructions? Was it a good faith effort? And our students here are very grade oriented, and when they learn that I'm really going to take off up to 20% of the paper grade if they don't engage in those activities the way I want them to, they get very, very motivated about it. And those things are all good for them, right? Writing drafts, revision, feedback. So I'm basically incentivizing them to do what they need to do. And I found that works pretty well. They're pretty annoyed with me the first time through, but then they get it. And they realize that the process helps them to do their best work.
One of the things that I didn't even tell my students to do, but they never started doing, is people would like feedback when they would revise their work. They would leave that feedback there to show what they have changed. And
that's nice.
Really have the demo, like maybe I should have all of them.
Yeah.
Like smaller things, I'll just remove them. But things related to content and some of the bigger problems that they have,
leave that comment
just
there.
leave that comment there to see if they made a change.
And you can have them put a comment back.
And even the peer review that I did was, and then my students just kept their peers' comments there, and then I would comment on those applicants and not on the But it would just, I like it. I liked it.
Oh.
What's that?
Thanks. It sounded like you were saying some good stuff, but it was a little hard to hear. Sorry. Ohio University person.
Maybe you can type a little summary of your comment, because we can't hear you. We couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Woohoo!
Okay, one of the things that I didn't intend to do, but my students just did on their own, and I teach graduate level writers, is that whenever I write comments on their drafts, some of them just left the comments there, and so to indicate what they have changed. And then even with peer review the other day, many of them kept the comments from their peers, and then I would respond to the comments that their peers have made on their document as well. And it's been working, and I'm trying to do it more systematically in future classes.
I like that. And I think the broader principle is worth raising of once students have received feedback, whether it's from peers or from the teacher, having some sort of follow-up to where the student shows that they've considered it. You know, whether they write a little reflection about here's what I learned from my peer review session and here's what I changed in my next draft as a result, or responding point by point to specific written comments from peers or from the teacher. The analogy I give for this is if you write an article for a journal and you submit it to a journal, oftentimes you'll get what's called a revise and resubmit decision, where you get all these reviewers' comments and you do a revision. You're supposed to send a memo to the editor explaining how you address the reader's comments. And when I do this as an author, I'll go point by point, you know, and I'll either explain, well, I added a sentence to page 3, or I took out that section, or I disagree with this comment and here's why. But the point is, and I do that very systematically, but the point is to show the editor that I have carefully considered the reviewer's comments and I'm treating them with respect. And so I try to build that into my own teaching of writing as well. Is, you know, whether it's your peer, whether it's the teacher, somebody has gone to the effort of reading your paper and tried to help you with feedback. So you don't necessarily have to do everything they say, but you do have to at least consider it. And I need you to show me that you considered it. Yeah, another thing I do besides the reflective stuff is I might have students, I don't do this with every paper, but sometimes I'll have students make a separate copy of a draft and turn on track changes and make whatever revisions so that I have a visual record of what they've changed between drafts, and then I'll usually have them write a verbal memo summarizing that as well. But that keeps them honest too, because they can't just change a preposition or a comma. They actually have to, you know, it's visual how much effort they made at revision. So, so I think it's really important. One of the studies I did on teacher commentary a few years ago, the teachers we were looking at teachers, not students, and the teachers expressed a lot of frustration about, I do all this work, I try so hard to give students good feedback, and they don't pay attention to it. I don't think it helps them. Makes me wonder why I waste my time. And one of my responses to that is, well, you have to make them take it seriously. You can't just hope they consider your feedback. You have to actually build in activities after they get feedback to allow them and require them to think about and apply that feedback, whether it's error correction or content feedback or whatever it is. You know, if it's worth putting all the time and effort into giving feedback, it's worth making sure they pay attention to it. Because, I mean, that's why you do it, right? So, kind of a summary comment or summary question is, overall, how do you think your approach to response, whether it's written comments, error correction, peer feedback, conferencing, so overall, how well do you think your approach to response works for L2 students in your classes? And how do you know? How do you know how well it works or doesn't work? So overall, how well do you think your approach to response works, and how do you know?
In my case, here in my institution, this is Sylvia, I think the approach that we use in terms of doing drafts and giving them feedback and then meeting with each of them individually, I mean, I think that helps. By the end of all this process and peer review in between in some of the classes, I think the students end up with a much better paper. But I always wonder, you know, that how the process, that it takes so much time, so much effort from them. And I teach in a very, you know, explicit way, and we front everything from the beginning. Our expectations are very, very clear, but it's not until students try it in their own writing, in their first draft, and they get my feedback and the conference and another draft, that eventually they get it. So I always wonder, are they just not paying attention before? They just need more time and they are just trying the first time? Or they just, you know, put the draft together they don't put much time and effort into the draft as much as they do later on with the feedback. So sometimes I wonder, it's just me in those papers, and sometimes I tell them, I'm not going to tell you everything, and you know, you have to do some thinking, otherwise I'm going to give A's to me, all of them to me.
Yeah, no, I have a daughter who's in college, and a couple of years ago she was taking first-year composition classes at her college, and I would see how she worked on her papers at home. You know, so she'd have to write a first draft for a Monday class, and then they would do the peer review, or she'd get teacher feedback on her draft, and she'd have a week to revise her paper. And as a teacher, to think, oh, they're spending the whole week thinking about their paper and doing a really good revision. Well, I can tell you, because I lived with her, exactly when she would work on her revision, which would be about 90 minutes before class a week later. You know, which means she wasn't giving herself adequate time to think about the feedback or to do a thoughtful revision. And, you know, I don't think, my daughter, you know, she was kind of a B student in first year composition. I don't think she's much worse than most students, but it definitely was an eye-opener for me about, you know, we hope they're really engaged in their own drafting and revision process, and maybe they're not, you know, as much as we would hope.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that, can you all hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah. One thing that we're doing at Ohio University is that we're asking all of the teachers we are coming up with a feedback plan that we're using in our writing courses. And then we're asking the teachers to share that in the way that would be appropriate for the student population. We have both graduate and undergraduate, to share how they give feedback and kind of train the students on their feedback practices, and then come back and ask students periodically how things are going in terms of their feedback, if it's working for them, what things they would like to see differently or continue to do the same. And again, at the end of the term, asking students how the feedback worked for them and what they gained and what they learned from the experience, so that students have a more direct role in their feedback, and also the faculty are more aware of the conscious choices that they're making within their feedback options.
So that's great. So there's both asking faculty to be reflective and intentional about their feedback practices, and then eliciting feedback from students about how well it's working for them, how well they like it. So that's a great two-way communication strategy. The Journal of Response to Writing would really love a write-up of that approach if you're so inclined ever. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm really not doing this webinar just to solicit manuscripts for our journal, but that it is the topic of the journal and the topic of this webinar. So, journalrw.org. Why don't I type that? Second, free and online, and its second issue will be out within a month. Just started this year.
Can I ask a question? This is Ryan Miller again. I have a question about self-evaluation.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Because it seems like you don't hear much about self-evaluation, but it seems like it'd be a useful skill for students to have, thinking about, say, in an intensive English program, you know, like a pre-matriculation, where we want to prepare students, you know, to go out in their other classes, and they're not always going to get extensive feedback on their writing. So it seems like self-evaluation skills would be really useful.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up. That is definitely something that I do in all of my classes. My response plan is always a mixture of teacher, peer, and self feedback. And so I think it's really important to give students structure and guidance at intervals where they go back and look at their own work and ask themselves questions about it and look for specific things. And I think there's a number of really nice, authentic ways to build that into the writing process, and also to build it into the writing class. Goal setting at the beginning, reflection at the end about how they progressed and where they need to keep making progress. I'll just give you one little example of something I do. I do a lot of different things throughout a writing class for self-feedback, self-development. One is they do a first draft of a paper, they get peer review in class, and then they do a revision after their peer review session with a little memo about what they've changed and what they learned from their peer review. Then I'll ask them to pose between one to three specific questions about their paper that they want me to respond to at that point in the drafting process. And I have to model a little bit for them what those questions might look like. For example, does the story I told in my introduction lead into the paper well? Or am I addressing the prompt adequately? Am I missing anything? An inappropriate question might be something like, how's my grammar? Or do my ideas make sense? Those are too vague. So I ask them to pose 1 to 3 specific questions. By that point, they've written two drafts, done a reflective memo, done peer feedback, so they have a pretty good sense of how their paper is shaping up and what they're struggling with. So I like to ask them to articulate where they have questions, where they need help, and then the hard part for me as a teacher, I will then look at the draft, look at those questions, and I respond only to those questions. Even though I might see other things that I'd like to comment on. Like, no, this is about a conversation between me and the student that is initiated by the student of where they think they need help with their paper, and I need to honor that. And so that's both self-feedback, and it's a way of focusing the interaction between me and the student during the drafting process. It works really quite well,
It seems like it would be useful for other classes too. Say a student then takes, I don't know, they're writing a paper for their physics class or something. That would help them to craft questions that they could ask to their, say, physics professor that are more targeted.
Yeah, or even if they're going to the writing center.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the 3 questions exercise works. I have used it both for conferencing and for written feedback. So if the student doesn't have time to come to my office, they can send me their 3 questions, and I'll respond to them. 1 to 3. They don't have to do 3, but no more than 3. So that's been an approach that's worked well for me too. Well, we have about 10 minutes to go, and I'm wondering if I just want to open the floor for other questions or comments that people might like to make about the whole endeavor of feedback. Any topic related to feedback.
I wanted to make a comment about self-assessment. For me, the ultimate goal is, just like for all of us, is to help the student, not just to help the student submit a better draft on that particular paper, but help them become reflective writers in the future. So what I do to help them do that is I combine peer review with self-assessment. I use the peer review sheets, the ones that we mentioned before, and after the students are done with the peer review sheet, I give them the second copy of the same sheet, and I ask them to evaluate their own paper using the same questions. And they do it better because they just evaluated their peers' paper using the same questions. So after they're done with that, they receive that paper from their peer. So now they have 2 peer review sheets. One is from their peer and the other one their own. So even if they just want to compare, you know, the answers, it's already good.
I like that. That's a nice approach. So before they see the peer feedback, they do the self-feedback. I like it.
Yes.
Cool. Other comments or questions?
I have a question. Actually, it's not really. It's just a particular case, but I have a challenge with balancing, you know, positive feedback with feedback that the student really need to work on. And actually, self-feedback sometimes doesn't work for particular students. One particular student came up and asked me, why did I get a D for my paper? Everything in my paper is perfect. It should get an A. I don't accept your D. Tell me what is wrong. And I say, you know, I tell him the areas where he can improve. But for that student, I told him, like, you can give your paper whatever you want, but as me, as an instructor, and as someone who, you know, I have a rubric. I show him what area he could improve. But again, for that particular student, you know, self-evaluation doesn't work. But yes, but I just wanted to see if any of you have, you know, a particular or any suggestion on that particular case. If the student, you know, can't see what they you know, what the positive comments I give seems to be everything that he sees, and he cannot see the thing that he needs to work on, and that's the problem I have. I don't know if you can give me any suggestions or directions.
I've had that experience too, and I remember one class I taught years ago where I had a student just like that, and he wouldn't listen to me, and I was a lot younger too, so maybe he thought I was too young to be his teacher, but and too female, but you know, he would argue with me about everything, and he'd already failed the class once, and then I had another student who'd also failed the class, and he was just a quivering, anxious wreck, and he was so sure he was going to fail the class again. And so for the first student, I had to convince him that he really wasn't as wonderful as he thought he was, that he actually did have some room to improve. And with the other student, I had to build his confidence and say, you know what, you're doing okay this time. We're going to get you through this. You're not going to fail the class again. This, you know, just, you know, follow my lead, and you know, it's going to be okay. And I really felt like I was a psychologist in that class. You know, some students need the, you know, the arm around the shoulder, and some need the kick in the pants. And so yeah, I mean, just reality grading and maybe not being too nice. I mean, I'm not saying being mean, but maybe dial back the positive feedback if the student will only pay attention to that, not listen to constructive criticism.
At Ohio University, one of the things we do is we have a grade appeal form for students, so which is across all of our courses. And so if a student feels that they have been graded unfairly, then we have that form posted in our Blackboard. And it's actually quite simple. It just asks the student to identify what the problem was that they had with the grade and what action they think would be fair. And that way also it allows us, if we do make mistakes, it's kind of a clean way to acknowledge that maybe we overlooked something or made a mistake in some way, and kind of without losing any face. But that extra step that requires students to identify what they think the problem was and write it up in a coherent fashion and go back to the syllabus and the rubric and try to justify their claims. Many students, hardly ever do students take us up on the opportunity. They might grumble about it, their grade, but once we invite them to fill out the form and we'll be happy to go ahead and look that over, somehow they never get around to completing the form, but it gives them that opportunity to be involved in the process.
No, I really like that, and I also like the acknowledgement that we as teachers can make mistakes and, you know, be in a bad mood or be in a hurry or whatever. And yeah, I'm a program director, and I've had for years had students who will complain that their TA, you know, they gave them an unfair grade on their portfolio, and they're always emailing, emailing me like during a quarter break or over the holidays, change my grade right now, I demand it, ooh, and I say, you know what, my office hours will be posted next quarter. If you want to come in and discuss your portfolio, then I'll be happy to discuss it with you. Never once, not once. I mean, you know, if they want action on December 23rd, you know, they get their grade, but they don't want it on January 8th in my office and make an argument. It's really interesting. Sometimes students just want to argue and hope they can wear someone down, a director or a teacher. But forcing them to make an argument, I mean, that's really good rhetorical skill too, and good metacognitive practice and everything. So, okay, well, I think we're pretty close to out of time. So, just as a final comment. I'd like to thank everybody who listened and participated via text or comment. Obviously, I think response is really important. To me, it's the heartbeat of good writing instruction. And not just teacher feedback, but all the different kinds of response that we've talked about. You don't become, writing is communication. It's communication with the reader. And you don't become more successful at it without feedback from actual readers about how well you've accomplished those purposes. So to me, it is worth the effort to try to think about how to do it well. It's worth reflecting on what's going well and what you could do better. It's worth trying to make it a two-way conversation with the students. It's worth trying to ask the students to do more to engage with the response and response cycle. It takes some effort to do it well, but to me, if you do it well, it's incredibly important and incredibly valuable to writing instruction and to the development of second language writers. So that's my little closing statement about response. And Sylvia, do you have anything you want to say to wrap up?
Thank you very much, Dana. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone who joined us today. I hope that you were all able to reflect on your own teaching and practice and bring some ideas to your own classroom and to the way that you respond to your students' writing. Have a nice day in California, Dana, and we will sure check out your journal for more ideas on responding to student writing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice evening, night.
Bye.